Excuse me, could we have everyone sit down? We have a very exciting set of panels for you this afternoon. And these panels are going to deal with some really hard issues around governance, institutions, and leadership. So I'd like to invite my first set of panelists to come and take their hot seats. And this panel on governance institutions, challenges and opportunities, especially focused, of course, on land use and transportation, all the issues we've been talking about in this conference. And I'll invite Tom Wright, who is the Executive Director and President-elect, congratulations, Tom, of the Regional Plan Association, to facilitate this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say it's fun working with Columbia, Ford, VREF, and all the other partners. Also, I got a kick yesterday, those of you who were here in the morning for the kickoff. Polly Trottenberg, Commissioner Trottenberg, opened by talking about how her father had worked here in the early 70s and how he would have been very thrilled that Lucite was still in vogue at the Ford Foundation. My dad actually worked in the same office as Art Trottenberg in the early 70s too, and I thought what she didn't notice was that under your right hand, if you flip that out, you can find the ashtray, and you can see this place really does not change. And maybe I thought like a kind of resistance to change could be a topic that we would address a little bit when we talk about institutions and institutional reform this afternoon. And thinking about transportation and land use issues, how much is resistance to change the underlying concern that we have, and how fundamental does change need to be in the different kinds of institutions we're talking about? We'll have to be very careful not to make generalizations and kind of assume that one size fits all in any context. But I do think that we have a terrific panel, and there are wonderful participants and discussants here today to kind of get a sense of where should we, are there some common themes and some common ideas that we ought to be pushing more in different places? What does the role of scale have to do with these? And what are kind of some of the best practices and where are things not going so well? I think I'll just start with a kind of, just to ask each of the panelists, if they could, to kick this off, to think a little bit about this topic. We all come at it from a sense that I hope we all do, that institutions are extremely important. So which ones do we think currently deliver the best services, do the best job of providing transport and that connection, that nexus between land use and transportation? Why would you say they're doing a good job? And is there kind of a model for a modern public authority, to try and do a little Gilbert and Sullivan here? What's the very model of a modern public authority for the 21st century going to look like? And if we can think a little bit about that, or anything else you want to start on this topic with, Rit?
Well, thank you, Tom, and thanks to VREF and all the other organizers. Governance is governance and institutions, of course, I think are fundamentally critical. So at least we can, at least for me, you can take that for granted. I'll make maybe three observations. One, I think, is this question of resistance to change, and I can't help but periodically think about, what Thomas Jefferson said, that a little revolution every now and then is a good thing. And one of the challenges, certainly, I think, in New York that we face is there hasn't actually been a significant institutional update in the major institutions shaping this region in more than a generation. Okay? And if you believe that everything's working perfectly, then that's appropriate. But if you believe that there are shortcomings, and I think those are undeniable in the New York region, then I think you have to ask yourself, well, what are the updates that we are missing? And I think we have some great institutions that when they were established, they were very well tailored to address the shortcomings of what had been going on prior to their establishment. Right? But inevitably, times change. Hopefully, those issues have gotten fixed. And then the question is the same structure actually well designed to address the next set of challenges that come up? And I think in our two main transportation institutions, the Port Authority and the MTA, Personally, I think we see a real shortcoming in that both the transparency and the incentives, the misalignment of incentives, I think particularly in the MTA, create an imbalance. We're going to see, we've already been seeing the problems at the Port Authority, where the overweening power of two governors has led to a complete lack of transparency, to the over-politicization of this really vital organization, which is contrary to the purposes for which it was established. And I think when it was established, it was probably state-of-the-art, and I think now it's quite obsolete. I think at the MTA, we see an organization that was established at a period when New York City was effectively bankrupt, when the transit system was in what many thought was near terminal decline. And now that's completely not the case. And yet we have the same structure, we have the same issues, or the same forces in charge of that organization that we had, frankly, in 1970. And I think that's a problem too. So the real question for me is, how do we get institutions updated, not believing that there's a panacea, but actually well-tailored to address the situation that we find ourselves in, and then leave the door open so that another generation can actually update them again.
Can do something else.
Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful way to kick off. Genevieve, now you work in Southern California, where there's been some new institutions and other things. How would you respond from that coast?
I thought I would start talking about this idea of resistance to change. And these are not my ideas. This is what we teach our students, basically, from the literature. But institutions, once they get established, have an enormous amount of inertia. And that inertia comes about, or it comes in many different kind of dimensions. One, of course, are the interest groups and the political stakeholders that created the institution in the first place, and all the various interests that they represent that have a stake in preserving that institution and, in fact, what the institution is doing and the policy direction that it's taking. So actually, there's a great deal of force on the side of institutional stability, at least in the United States. And in fact, we admire institutional stability. We like to have our institutions around for a long time because that's an indicator of political stability. So the real question is, under what circumstances do things change? What does it take to actually generate a major or significant institutional change, either in a policy direction or in the establishment of a new agenda, or in the establishment of totally different institutions, which is also often the way things work, at least in the United States. And some very smart political scientists often talk about policy windows. So under what circumstances does a new interest group, a new force, have the stars aligned in such a way to actually be able to make a difference and achieve a very significant change? I won't take the time right now, but maybe later on in later questions, we have some rather remarkable examples of radical institutional change, at least in Southern California. One has to do with changes in public transport policy, and the other one has to do with changes in port operations. So if we have a chance, I'll go back to that. But
why don't you give us one? I'll give you a little more time on public transport policy, where I have a sense of where you're going to go.
Okay. Some of you probably may know that Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles, which I might emphasize is only part of a major metropolitan area, but it's the biggest part, roughly 10 million people of the 18 million people of the metropolitan area, has embarked on a journey that actually started way back in 1980 when the first sales tax measure was passed, attached to a major investment plan in public transport. Since that 1980 time period, the voters have voted to tax themselves 2 more times. So in that county, there's a 1.5 cent sales tax on absolutely everything that is generating in the neighborhood of $1 to $2 billion a year in local revenue. With that $1 to $2 billion a year, Los Angeles County is literally restructuring its transportation system by massive investments in public transport and rail and subway systems. So that is not anybody's typical image of Los Angeles, but that's, to me, an example of a very large policy and institutional change.
Thank you. Jiang, we often look to Asia for kind of new models and have a sense that there's much more innovation, flexibility happening over there. Is that misplaced?
Yeah. Actually, I come from China with more than 5,000 years history. And we had a new country just over 65 years. So we call it the institution reform, just the past 15 years. And recently, from the central government, we have been taking place the 2008, that's merging the MOT and the urban transportation responsibility have been changed from the administration of housing come to the administration of transportation. That's the first step. And last year, the rail administration of rail have been come to the MOT again. So it's currently the situation that's like the US DOT, almost all the modes together. And back this before, there are mainly the barriers was taking place. For example, it's a city surface transportation. Let's say the buses. The line, which line will go to the buses, which line will go to the car, that's decided by policemen. And the investment for the bus line, it goes to the NDRC. And operation goes to the transportation department. And also for the land use planning, that goes to the planning authority. So there is not staffs, just it's overlapped. But then when we look at the countryside and the city, that big difference with the US. We have the 50% people live in the countryside. Then we see the big difference is bus service. So we get in the change in 2008, and throughout China afterwards, they try to merge the one transportation authority at city level. So they're in charge of all the models, but the rail outside. But this year comes the rail on the umbrella, but how to work, that just needs some time to make the generation to change. I think that's a observation. And also, we had extremely the example taken in Beijing, just 15 miles away in Beijing, we call the University Village. It's many people working in the area, but belong to Beijing. The people come by buses to Beijing. They use the 16 yuan, but they go to that area from Beijing city to go to that county. It takes 2 yuan. So because they are managed by the different scale.
By different scales.
Yeah, so that they also very big conflicts between the countryside service and the particular for the suburb actually. So in that, then we come to merging. We say they integrate the rural transportation and the city transportation. So that is the taking place change.
Great.
Yeah, I think a lot of things we need to do, but on how it's really try to ask looking at how could be possibly integrated with the land use. That's another part of that.
Right.
Yeah, because we have many diversity in China cities. We from the Shenzhen and to the east to the western area, we have totally different. In Shenzhen, we have one authority, the transportation authority, like New York. But if we go to the Urumqi, then you will find the bus company. They are sometimes out the hand of the transportation authority. So there is a difference, but we try to move this to as the integrated the multi-models. Yeah, and outside it's land use and also for the investment.
Sure, great. Well, Harry, I know you've worked in several different major metropolitan regions. You're currently in London, which also has gone through I think every one of these has gone through something more recently than New York. What would you say are kind of the main observations and what's working and what's not there?
If I may, I'll start with the importance of institutions and governance. Generically speaking, I'm of the view that we do need to examine the extent to which, wherever we are, our institutional framework is fit for purpose in light of the 21st century challenges and opportunities. This actually requires politicians, planners, investors to highlight what risks are out there, whether it's climate change, whether it's global financial threats, to put on the negative side, or whether it's technological innovation on the positive. There needs to be a new framing of resilience tests for institutions. This needs to be done from perspectives of the public sector, the private sector, and what we can call the third sector, those parties that fall between. Second point, and the reason why I'm arguing this is because in starting off with this common agenda, we are of the belief, on the basis of research we've conducted at the Omega Center, that to their surprise, there may be commonalities that these parties find, even though they think they're coming from a different perspective. The second point, which is linked, is that I have argued, and it has been argued elsewhere, not just by myself, that institutions should be the fourth pillar of the sustainability vision. If you do not have institutions that are sustainable and are able to perpetuate the vision of sustainability, if you keep on chopping and changing institutions, you set up institutions and pull them down, you don't have this institutional memory, you don't have the institutional capacity to see through. So I think that if you take into account that institutions are the channels of power, the channels of funding, and the channels of capacity, manpower, female power, forgive the gender bias, they can constitute what makes economic, social, and environmental sustainability deliverable. And in that regard, I really think we need to sort of look again at what we see in institutions. The third starting point for this discussion, from my perspective, and this, I worked in Hong Kong, in Indonesia, in the UK, in Denmark. I've been around. I think one thing I learned from Hong Kong was that the private sector needs a competent public sector to make its profits. There is a vested interest in actually the private sector having a competent public sector, and the public sector similarly needs to have a private sector that actually understands where the risks and opportunities are in a shared manner. If one was to accept that premise, then we get rid of a lot of the tension, unnecessary tension that exists in this debate. Finally, those of you who know me will realize I'm not shy of raising tensions. Transparency and accountability have to be there, but the awkward, tensional, generating issue, does this mean you have to have democracy as well?
And do you think the answer is yes or no? Or
I'm not convinced. Or putting it another way, I have my views, my political views, but there are different paths. And the realities are, I'm not a political scientist, that there are political realities. I think that the truth of the matter is that in some respects, if you look at the agenda of the challenges of the 21st century, whether it be climate change, energy peaking, you actually cannot make progress without transparency and accountability. And in providing transparency and accountability, there is elements of democracy. But we have seen democracy defined and redefined in different ways, and we've seen the rhetoric of democracy. So who am I to actually come to a conclusion on this?
well, can I ask you to be more specific there? Has there been a context, a city or region you've worked in that you felt failed an important test of accountability and transparency? And how did that play out? I mean,
Yes, let's talk from home. the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, I think I made mention of that before, when we undertook the research at the Omega Centre to look at the feasibility study that based the financial premises upon which it went ahead. And incidentally, I was very supportive of it. We as researchers could not access information on the basis of confidentiality of the private sector. And what is absolutely nonsense here is that actually it was a made-up confidentiality clause because the private sector, in this case it was Eurostar, has shareholding of the French and British governments. So as a construct, one could, if you were
A fig leaf.
Machiavellian, I mean, I'm not Machiavellian, of course, but if you had Machiavellian frame of thinking, it's a construct not to have access for the information that you need in order to find out how decisions were made. And if you don't have transparency, how can you learn from the mistakes and the successes of the past?
Right.
So, and this is in the vested interest of both the public and private sector. We're all wanting to, you know, have successful efforts and investments. And a final point, of course, which I haven't said, and it's already been alluded to, is in the transparency we need to identify winners and losers, because somewhere you said which is the best job and which is the best model, and I've got a comment here for whom. When we ran a project in consultation with some consultants, a live project, and the question had winners and losers, I was told by the consultant, can we use a different word, please? Can we not please talk about winners and losers? Because, the truth is we need to actually realize there is winners and losers geographically over time and in different places.
From what happens. I have to say, I think the New York audience would tap into what you're talking about in terms of lack of transparency. There is a large bridge currently under construction over the Hudson River, of which we still don't know what the financing model will look like. But the argument is essentially if there was transparency, there would be rejection, and therefore it moves forward with that. Rit, can I tip some of that to you? The other thing I'd ask you about is Harry's comments about sustainable institutions. Do you agree, and do you think that runs counter to where you're trying to go?
I don't know. I think the question, and actually, Harry, I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts on how long do you want an institution to last, right? Because I think there's a question, yes, it's good to have your governments and your sovereign entities last for perhaps centuries. That creates the kind of stability that one wants, but your special purpose entities, may need to be renewed. Now, that could be renewed with changing a setup entirely. It could be renewed by an internal reorganization. And of course, you don't want to do this every 3 or 4 years, which many corporations fall prey to. A new CEO comes in and says, well, the answer is just to reslice all the divisions, so it can be taken to an absurd level. But what would you say is the right kind of time frame that provides that balance?
Well, there are institutions. You mentioned institutions of delivery. I can understand that, but institutions of delivery should not become strategic institutions. If you're delivering a project, they should be answerable to a hierarchical authority which has a longer lifespan. I'll make 2 points to that. One is the resilience test of fit for purpose has to be continuously imposed on long-lasting institutions. But I could also similarly argue how long should private sector parties last? And this is most important because in public-private partnerships, we're told that these institutions who are promising to invest in these public projects are going to be around for 30, 40, 50 years. And that hasn't been always the case. So I think we've got a common issue here, and not having sustainable institutions in the private sector and the public sector are real issues. So it's not a one-sided theme.
Sure. I'm glad you brought up PPPs, if I could say, since I feel like there's a kind of third way that's being discussed right now. Is there a sense whether that is going to get at some of these issues, or is there a sense of optimism, or will this be 5 years from now we won't be talking about that at all?
About PPPs?
Yeah.
at least in the US, I think we're going to be talking about them for a really long time. Mainly, and remember, we're behind the curve. The use of PPPs is way more advanced in Europe and in Canada than it is the United States and
Why
in
would you
several
say
other
that
countries.
is?
Good question. I think it has to do with perceptions, particularly in this country, are sort of fundamentals, perceptions about the role of the private sector and the role of the public sector. And in this country, we sort of think of PPPs as a way to get private sector money because the public sector has run out. I mean, basically, that's what it's about.
They're financing, not.
So can we please get some private capital in here so that we can really build your bridge? And there's much less thought about the private sector as a source of capital, investment, for which there has to be a revenue stream to actually pay it all back.
Sure.
And that thinking, I think, is more structured in other parts of the world where they get it in a way that I'm not sure the US in general gets it very much of the time.
Well, I've also, because I've often kind of wondered, and especially getting to the transport and land use side of things, often, of course, we've seen in other metropolitan regions, it's the land use that provides that appreciated value that can create the kind of financing mechanism. And yet, many of our models in the US, again, have a kind of strict segregation between those two. So thinking more towards that issue, and is greater integration of these the direction that we need to go in North America in our context, or and how is that? I mean, again, I'll kind of look to Asia as a place where they seem to be very closely connected in some places.
Yeah, actually, I have read the books which run, I think, the Professor Soria here. Yeah, actually, talking about the TOD. That's basically it's those TOD can only happen with the marketing economy. So back last week I've been also in MDR in Hong Kong, and they did excellent job. Then actually they have strategic thinking as to how the company is running the metro at the beginning. So they have budgeting and they designing, and then also have the different integration of different models together. And then the station also it's the destination for the people to live in, their housing. And also during the day they can buy what they want. That's the basic idea. But behind this it's working for people. That means that for the passenger coming and going, working for money. More people, they get more money. So that is the marketing theory.
Right.
How apply in China itself, because we are state-owned, and our land belongs to state government, and then the mayor will say, I get the land center, working with the developers, it's very good, it's good enough, I can get money to this pocket.
Right.
Then I give this to the building for the metro. So that's kind of different things that we are thinking behind the zero. We hopefully we can do something really new changing for the land value capture, particular for at the stage of the shortage of money for the long term for the construction of the particular for interchange and the stations, but still the words there, the central government has opened for the integrated land development, but on the ground, you will find the planners, city planners, and how together with transportation and how together with the developers, then come to the operator. Because operator state owned. If I earn the money 1 million, then the city government will minus my income 1 million. That's what I want to do. So we need to try to find the incentive, the instruments to help this. We call it the socialist country. We do the land use value capture. That's a challenge for us.
I see.
Can I
Sure.
clarify something? And that is that you started out with the question of PPPs, which is really sort of about money. And then you used the example of transit-oriented development and value capture. That's an institutional issue.
Yes. And there is a question is kind of how much of this is resources and how much of it is reform?
Because we have many examples around the country of very successful transit-oriented development where the local governments have put in place plenty of different incentives, zoning incentives, parking incentives, et cetera, to make development more attractive and to attract that kind of development. So all that, I think we have many, many examples of best practices. But when it comes down to the money, where do taxes go? Property taxes go to local governments. Are the local governments the transit operators who are actually floating the finances? No. So there is this sort of institutional disconnect there, and that takes a lot of negotiation to get past, which is why I think it is more difficult to do value capture, for example, in the US.
Sure. Although, of course, New York was able to do something along those lines, or at least we're still floating the bonds out of the general revenue today, but we still have hopes for that. How about when you were putting together Plan YC, Red? I'm kind of curious. Did you look at, and I think Harry's kind of new framing for resiliency is a nice test to use towards this. Did you kind of look aggressively at these institutions? And you were coming, of course, from that municipal perspective. So there were certain things you had a lot of control over and others very, very little.
And it would not necessarily have helped us to propose significant reforms to agencies that weren't our own.
We're outside your purview.
So we held back from that somewhat, tactically.
Never stops us on the civic side.
Well, that's the advantage of being out of office.
We have no control over anything.
I think I'm going to dodge your question a little bit because I think the bigger issue and what did inform some of our thinking in Plan YC was really about aligning the powers and incentives. And I think this, actually all three of you have now commented on things that touch on that. And I'd argue that one of the problems, one of the mistakes I think we make over and over again, particularly in transportation, is we think about public and private as though they're two uniform entities. And we think about PPPs as though there was one model for a public-private partnership, when in fact all three of those terms are completely fluid, and it all depends on exactly how the rules are structured, exactly how the incentives are structured. And if the incentives are well aligned so that the overall purpose of an entity fits or is furthered by the incentives that are driven through it, then you will generally get what you're trying to obtain. And if they're not, then you're probably not going to get what you want. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that many institutions have kind of an organizational lifespan, because if you design those incentives well for one purpose, once that purpose is finished, you struggle to have the same organizational structure actually meet a new set of goals. I think we see it actually, the United States is still trying to figure out a national transportation policy in a post-interstate highway construction era. And I don't think we've figured it out. I've worked at DOT nearly 20 years ago at this point, and we were just beginning to try to figure it out then, and 20 years later, I don't think we've figured it out. Joshua, you can say something on that later. Because we had an organization that was fundamentally really, really effective at getting money out to states to build highways that were primarily driven by state DOTs. And when that was no longer the mission, we've struggled to figure out how to do it. But I think this is the common thread here where, your point about the misalignment and who's paying the costs versus the value that gets created, the same challenge in China. Many people believe that is, and Harry, you'd have a better perspective on whether that's one of the reasons that MTR has been a very successful operator. But, I think we see it over and over again. I mean, I look at some of the institutions in New York, and I think it's true for many public sector entities where when an organization is new and it's created to achieve a specific purpose, it attracts people who are committed to that purpose. There's a common understanding of what it's trying to get done, so its accountability to the public is framed in terms of whether it's getting that done or not. Once it achieves that, one of the key objectives for many entities is just to stay out of the newspaper, right? And particularly when you have entities that literally lose more money every time they get more ridership, you're not actually setting up incentives that create an organizational imperative to be creative in ways to produce more transportation, right? And I think those are some of the things that a good governance and institution design take into account.
Would look at? Well, here, before I tip it to you, I'll say, of course, Governor Rick Perry is looking for some more federal agencies to shut down for his next run. So maybe we can send you over to consult for him. Harry, how would you respond to those?
Well,
those
I like to
issues?
get back to the PPP as,
okay.
as a concept, and then, I mean, I run a master's program on mega infrastructure planning, appraisal, and delivery. And actually some planners and architects and a number of other professions attend it. And my recommendation to them all is they read this book, and anyone who wants it, I'll find a reference and give it to you, on rhetoric. Rhetoric is incredibly important, and there's positive and negative rhetoric, which I learned. Now, why am I raising this? You asked me, or the question came across like that, do I sort of support PPPs? Now, I think it was Confucius that said if we all defined our terms clearly, we would understand each other much better. Public, absolutely. Private, absolutely. Partnership, absolutely. But where is the partnership in many of these PPPs? Actually, I'd go further than that. In places like India and places like Indonesia, where's the public in the PPP? Because the capacity is not there. So then I come closer to home. Malcolm Gladwell, New York, right? Raised, sure. I believe. His book on tipping points talked about contagion fashions. This is an example of contagion ideas being globalized, now irresponsibly, perhaps, without sufficient thought, perhaps, knowingly abusing those that are using on the losing side, perhaps. The truth of the matter is, and forgive me for disagreeing with the idea that Europe has got it right on PPP, the European Investment Bank has just closed down its special division on PPPs. It was based upon the English model for hospitals and the like, on the basis that the results were so embarrassing that the template that they were promoting actually didn't stand up to testing. So then the rhetoric goes on, and we're going back to Malcolm Gladwell. We're still talking about where is the evidence, not anecdotal, not the promotional stuff that the private sector's putting out, even lecturers in universities. We're all so desperate for a templated panacea solution. However, going back to Confucius, if we did really define our public, if we did really define our concept of partnership, and I think partnership differs, and the concept of partnership in Indonesia is different in China and different in England. Sure. So we need to be a little more reflective on this. And the only way we're going to make progress is actually to jointly scrutinize this model, because huge amounts of money is invested in this. And if we don't get it right, we're wasting money potentially. Finally, winners and losers. It's quite surprising, is it, in parenthesis, that in so many instances it's the public sector that picks up the bill for failing PPPs, the private sector. It's also interesting to note that the private sector, where it makes money, carries on making money. Now, from my point of view, that's a pretty good business model. What isn't smart is that the public sector is not challenging this. And what is even more worrying is that those parties in the public sector who understand the PPP model are increasingly, by virtue of salaries at least, moving over to the private sector. So you actually haven't got a capacity in the private sector to relinquish, and there's one more sting. Sure. They actually don't have the ability to monitor. Now, we in the Treasury in the UK who do these PPPs so well, in our Treasury have a shortage. Senior civil servants now are leaving and have been left, being encouraged to left on the neoliberal model that's being pursued. But they still need this expertise. So what's the solution? Guess. We hire people from Price Waterhouse as 3-year contracts to advise us on the design of PPPs for the next tranche. Now, this is not rocket science to work out that there's a transparency problem here. And we in Britain, and actually Europe has a different stance on this,
Sure.
presenting ourselves as the model that you should employ in Delhi, in China. Give me a break, you know. But the trouble is, this Gladwell contagion idea is being taught in classrooms, it's in the books. Tell me where the reports are on monitoring PPPs and PFIs that have got out there in Bloomberg. Tell me.
Well, Jen, can I ask if, let's ask from Asia. I mean, do you agree with that perspective, and do you think that this contagion idea has infected, or?
I think the people participation is a challenge. Even in many policy area. I mean, take we had the 2008 during the Olympic Games, our the price for the buses and also metro in Beijing have declined. Have been the government say, okay, we discount from the 2 yuan to 0.4. That's a large discount. I think that's a decision making every people happy. But until today, 5 years after, and the Beijing government have to pay 20 billion every year for subsidy. And next month, they want to increase in the price for the metro as the first start. Yeah, because after Olympic Games, there is more than 13 cities. They also decreased the price. But many buses companies, they cannot stand it because the government is not as strong as Beijing. So Beijing have to stand up. Then they come say, okay, this the people participation. Then how you manage this? So at the beginning, they say, okay, we working for people, so we decrease the price. Then coming in, then once we want to say the sustainability of the bus company or the metro, then the private and particularly the people, when we go to the hearing processor, there is a lot of the oil is coming outside that side. But I think that once we to make the decision making 2008, we need to go to the consultation again, so that no matter, because I think that is not the good story for us, because we taking the pay for that. And today, we are still talking about public transportation and car ownership. That's still the debate. And I think you said the PPP more working towards the infrastructure. They make money. But talking about the public service, that's still missing the people's participation. I think that's the same story for us, China, to really to think about that. Okay. We had we say the sleeping town in many cities. Sometimes the more than 20,000 people, they live there without public transportation because the planner forgot that. And then they go back to many protesting. Or they just go to the government, say they through we have the People's Congress. Then they go to city government, say, okay, we need the bus company, it's coming. So they're at the beginning we need more consideration of the people participation. I think particularly for the policy side.
Does anyone have a last question before I start to invite our response or comment? Genevieve? No? No? Okay. Why don't we then invite Heather Allen to come up as our first discussant to give a little bit of commentary on this, and if you want to ask some questions, fire away.
Don't encourage me.
Sure.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Big targets over here.
Yeah. So I picked up several themes that seem to come through from this very animated panel, which was great. And there's obviously a lot to do with context. You need to, the institutions need to be relevant to the context. There also seems to be a lot of inertia and inflexibility still in these institutions. A lot of blurring of the edges as to where the power actually extends to and what their mandate really includes. I've luckily worked in sustainable transport for many years and kept my carbon footprint fairly high. So I've traveled really all over the world and seen many different institutions that are responsible for transport. And there is everywhere fragmentation. So that is another thing that is very clear. And this debate about the fit for purpose, when institutions were maybe created, they were possibly fit for that purpose. The ones here, you mentioned it, that at that time in 1928 or 30 or so, the way they were set up was at the cutting edge of corporate governance, but it's no longer there. Looking at that and looking at the sustainability picture, which is certainly the space that I work in, we know that change is certainly on the agenda. What we've got is not necessarily fit for purpose in terms of the combination of urban transport and land use and all the other sustainability imperatives that are out there. So we also see outside of the transport sector a great change going on, actually. I was able to take part in the climate summit that was held here a few weeks back and was very encouraged to see the new thinking that's going on in many of the other sectors. So looking at that and some of the work that's being done by international agencies such as the International Energy Agency and the new commission that's led by Lord Stern, where they say that by 2050 they're going to need about 25 million kilometers of paved roads, 300,000 kilometers of new rail infrastructure, passenger and freight demand is going to double, and obviously the growth in cities. This really sets the picture for the sustainability agenda and the transport agenda over the next 15 to 20 years, which is the window that we have for our action on that. So, my question then really is, how ready are the institutions that we have in all the different places, in the different continents and cities? Are they really ready for addressing this future? I would suggest that we don't have time for change. We need to work better with what we already have and to look at how we can bring efficiencies into the way that we work. Efficiency is really one of the underpinning elements of sustainability. If you look at the point you made, Tom, about the fact we've all got ashtrays on our seats, it would be inconceivable today if Rick or Harry or yourself lit up on the stage. I mean, we would not imagine that to be a possibility. And yet within our lifetime, that change in perception has actually happened. So really, I'm looking at, let's step back from the technology and the technical approach. Let's look at really where the integration and the integrated approaches could be put in place. Transport, we know, is complex, but it's not necessarily complicated. And the difference between complex and complicated is that there are solutions to a complicated problem. But there's no one solution to a complex problem. You need to have the enabling environment. And I think that is what is really missing in the institutions at the moment, that enabling environment. So that's my question to you. Where can you see that happening, and what would you recommend to happen in order to have that enabling environment so that we can not only bring a better transport agenda on board, which will deliver a lot of the local advantages of quality of life, low emissions and everything else, but also deliver the higher sustainability agenda that we all have.
Wonderful way to put it. Thank you, Heather. Somebody want to jump in? In some ways, I feel like this is a challenge a little bit to the
Well,
to what you laid out.
I mean, in fairness, yes, I think you're right. We don't have a lot of time, but the real question is, are you going to waste more time by trying to work in structures that are fundamentally flawed or outdated, or are you better off, to break that mold, accept that you're kind of making a capital investment of time, as it were, in changing institutions in order to have better outcomes? And I guess it fundamentally depends on the specific situation, the specific context, et cetera. I mean, I think for the couple that I worry about, I think we've tried over and over again to reform them, and there are fundamental issues. I do get back to this question of where are the incentives driven through an organization, right? Because that is, I think, a key question to be asking. If you've got, I mean, to your point, Harry, about some of the PPPs, I mean, honestly, it's, if you've got a for-profit player who's short-term, whose only incentives are to maximize profits in the short term, getting angry at them because they've done that is like getting angry at a mosquito because it bites you, right? The question is, why are we putting those institutions in a position where that tendency is going to do harm, right? Which gets to, I think, your broader point, which is there a structure that are we gravitating towards structures that are facile solutions that fundamentally don't work? And I think this is the crux of the matter, is at the very highest level of a given organization in terms of personnel, at the mid-level, the most junior levels, what are the incentives? And we do unfortunately find that one of the key things, I mean, I think it's a terrible commentary on the transportation, or at least the public transit industry in the United States, that the career path is you get to the top of the public agency, and then you go to make money in a consulting firm that works for a public agency, right? I mean, that's actually a really screwed up career ladder that has all sorts of terrible consequences, frankly, right? And I think one of our key questions is we definitely need to think about paying better salaries at some of our public agencies and public institutions, because you can't expect people to work for altruism forever, and you can expect that of a small number of people, but you can't actually have the deep talent pool that you need to solve most of these problems over the long term in that way. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Sure,
Yeah.
and then I'll come. Although I'm going to ask each of you also, Rit did us the honor of kind of saying he thinks that the institutions he's thinking about, I think in New York, are fundamentally flawed. I'd be curious to know if each of you from your own context believe that to be the case in the city that you're working in too.
Well, culture of short-termism is a culture that appears to prevail. I think it was Ulrich Beck that presented the case that the 21st century is going to be the century of risk and uncertainty. That more than this was in 1998, I think, his publication, and that's sure been the case. Why does the government employ parties that basically look for short-term measures? They should know better. Well, in our case, I can't explain for your situation in New York, but I would just explain the case in the Treasury, why we have. But it's not just because it's not just the private sector, and I'm going to differentiate, because the private sector, as you quite rightly said, is not just one monolithic, but it's also the politicians. And I think that this actually needs to be said. I don't aim for a political career, so I'm able to say it. Trust in politicians in the 21st century is probably at its lowest globally. This may or may not have been true before, but I think it has reached a height, and we are now being informed. We are now being informed increasingly by scientific knowledge of facts that it is not in the interest of the career of the politicians to use that knowledge for long-term investment. The positive side, because there are positives to this, believe it or not. The positive side,
Thank God.
The positive side is that there are innovative entrepreneurs who can see that there's money to be made out of long-term solutions. In other words, the short-term investors, there's a battle taking place in the private sector between the long-term and the short-term investors. The Hong Kong Shanghai banks, for example, which I know quite well, has actually, in its infrastructure portfolio, had a much longer-term perspective on investing in the infrastructure. When these banks fail, and there are contagion links here, when these banks banks like Barclays went to sovereign wealth funds to bail themselves out that had short-term interests. And all of a sudden, these long-term traditional investors in infrastructure are threatened by short-term investors. So there is a reason behind this, and I think this is of a threat. I would put this in the resilience test, a threat to the private sector too, because some of these parties are making 18% per annum on the emerging market rates of return on infrastructure. They will not touch anything less than 10%. You do not get 10% per year on infrastructure investment in the so-called developed. So, you know, there is, I'll stop there.
There's a link there. Genevieve, yeah.
I would like to answer the question in a different way. And I think what you're really asking is, how does change happen? And you talked about how in other sectors you see more going on than in the transportation sector. But if you look at the transportation sector and you ask, where's the change going on? The change is going on primarily at the local level. That is to say, there are, you know, very specific problems, very specific interests, very specific issues, and very specific leadership that has the talent to generate consensus. And once you get consensus, then that consensus is what actually forces institutional change. Yeah. And so I think
does it force institutional change?
Either or a new institution is formed.
Right.
I mean, eventually, if there's enough consensus out there, something is going to happen. And so I'd like to just use the example from the ports of LA and LA and Long Beach, which are public institutions, and which managed to cooperate and create what was called the Clean Air Action Plan back in 2006, in response to very strong community opposition to what was going on at the ports. I mean, I can tell a longer story, but I won't. The objective was to reduce emissions from port-related activities, in particular particulate emissions, which, by the way, was shown with science and evidence to be dramatically affecting the health of people that were living nearby. And over the period of this Clean Air Action Plan, something on the order of 75% of all the emissions coming from trucks were gone in a matter of 4 or 5 years. So that, to me, is dramatic change. It's in the transportation sector, and it happened, you know, under very special circumstances. But I think those are the kinds of things we need to look at. I'm not normally the optimistic person in the room, but I guess so. I see change happening a lot, and I think that those are at least some of the things that I'm observing. The other kind of piece of this that I think is worth throwing out there to the group is this concept of voluntary regulation, which is also related to this idea of consensus and deal making, essentially. And so we get people to the table, we get the private sector to the table, we get the various stakeholders to the table, and the discussion is, okay, what will you do for me? And then, therefore, what will I do for you? And you heard this morning from earlier today about Stacy's story about the private sector coming and saying, please give me green curbs and I will give you electric vehicles, right? Well, that's an example of voluntary regulation. We can show you what we can do for you if you can do something for us. And what I'm seeing is a lot more, at least at the local level, of public sector entities being able to negotiate those kinds of outcomes.
Great. There's an optimistic level. Jiang, do you want to comment on this? Or?
Yeah, I think that talking about the sustainability of the institution, I think the capacity building, so from the bottom to the up, I think that is very challenging and also the opportunity for this. We do have the when officials from different fields come to the Department of Transportation at city level, some of them from the military service, they come to, I think, one side of that. It's really normal.
Uh-huh.
So like the challenge is how to the education, like really, I mean the staffs, the government staff, and then we how well it's they promote once they get it done. A lot of things it's like you said, the salary. I don't think the salary are attractive for most of the Chinese officials today. It's not like the 2 years ago. So like they first education. I think the continuous education that it will lead to the government capacity building is part of it. And all this better you do in US DOD, better in China we do. And also I think we need to have this someday fund particular to help this kind of the local government enhance their governance. And talking about environmental, I think the people not too much thinking about my transportation, how to work with the environment department, and how we can negotiation with the people, and how we really talk about the indicators. So I think that's a fundamentally continuously the sustainability for the institution.
Capacity is, the truth is this panel started about 3 hours ago at lunch upstairs, and as Rit was saying, capacity, we've kind of watched some of the Port Authority and other public authorities really be reduced and lowered in the kind of respect that they're held in the internal capacity, whereas New York City has been, we've watched them move in both directions in this region. Can I invite Joshua Schenk up to give a couple comments and ask a question to the panel?
Thanks. That's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm Joshua Schenk. I run the Eno Center for Transportation. We're a transportation policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. And I think we have some both research and activities that are directly relevant to a couple of questions that have been posed. So I want to comment on those, and then I'll ask a question. So the two issues I want to comment on, one is this issue of when can institutional change occur, and then the other one is transparency. I think they're both very relevant. With respect to when change can occur, we just completed a study of regional transit governance, looking at 6 different regions around the country and their readiness for reform of their institutions. And I can tell you that there is one clear way that you can see reform and one clear place that you cannot. So in Chicago, there is right now a growing feeling that there's a huge need for reform of the transit infrastructure, the transit institutional structures there, because they're completely failing and they're not able to maintain their infrastructure adequately, and they are not innovating in any way. They had trouble putting in a regional fare card. And you're seeing that issue come up in the governor's race right now, and that it is likely that there will be some, there was a governor's task force on the issue. It is likely that there will be some reform next year on the issue. Contrast that with another case study, which was Dallas region, where they are building out their rail system quite extensively, without regard to whether there are going to be any riders of the rail system. And they said, well, they're going to build the rail system to Dallas-Fort Worth. They just completed the connection to Dallas-Fort Worth, and the reason was so that they could be a world-class city, not because anyone's going to use that particular infrastructure. And they are doing, the reason no one's going to use it, of course, is because their land use has no connection whatsoever to their rail system, so they can build out the rail system all day and no one's going to ride it. And meanwhile, they have an enormous public bus system that they're neglecting and that they have no interest in an actual reform of. And the reason they have no interest in reforming the bus system is because poor people ride the bus system. And the reason they want to build rail is because developers like that, and they like to be able to at least say they're building out rail to make it a world-class city. So it's a question of who controls the money. And in Dallas, the developers are controlling the money, and the developers are able to make it so that the money is spent in ways that further their business interests. In Chicago, the business interests are recognizing that if they don't get their transit system in order, they're going to have a serious economic problem. And that's why there's change there. They're likely to be changed there. Another similar example, we're working, it's completely outside of the urban issues, well, not completely, but a little bit outside of urban issues. We're working on air traffic control reform right now in D.C. And air traffic control reform has been on the table for a long time, but it's been opposed by the unions for the last 20 or 30 years. And the unions are very nervous about the idea of moving air traffic control, which is currently within the Federal Aviation Administration, outside of that. But now the unions have changed their mind, and the reason they changed their mind is the federal government is so completely dysfunctional that they're realizing they probably don't want to be a part of it anymore. And so what happened was, you may have known, there was a sequester of federal funds last year. There was a shutdown of the federal government. And the unions that used to never want to come to the table to discuss this institutional change and were completely opposed to any concept of it are now at the table and are now seriously considering how reform might occur. So another way that reform occurs is that when things are so completely awful that the stakeholders who previously had a vested interest in the system now see that their vested interest has changed. So those are just some examples on when can change occur. On transparency, I think there are just two quick points I want to make. The issues of P3s came up, and we just did a big report on P3s. It came out in June, and one of the things we found is that one of the biggest barriers to completing these projects is a lack of transparency. That in fact, because the private sector did not do a very good job, or at least the public and private sectors together did not do a good job of reaching out to the public and getting their input on the project early on, they got shut down when they started to put the project out. And the fact that the private sector was involved was just an excuse to knock down a project. It had nothing to do with the project itself, with the private sector's involvement itself. It had to do with the fact that the public had not been engaged in the process of developing the investment. And that has to be true for a public sector project and a private sector project. So I think transparency is really important. Another good example is in Kansas. There is, one of the things I've been struck with over the last few days of this conference is that many people may not realize how little analysis goes into our investment decisions in transportation in this country. And one place that has done a great job of putting analytical decision-making into investment decisions is the Kansas Department of Transportation. And the way that they were able to do that, not surprisingly, is to involve the public in those decisions and to explain to the public why they were making the different decisions they were making, what the criteria that they were using. And that's why they were able to create momentum around investment decisions that actually took money that was normally going to roads in rural areas that 5 people were using and investing it in the economic engines of that state, which are the urban areas. So transparency can have a real impact. Now that I've cut those, I'm going to ask you a question that has nothing to do with those, not that you can't certainly comment on them. But this issue came up, and I think it came up primarily because of the example Jen used of Los Angeles, where the taxation was an impetus for real reform. And I think this is a question that comes up all the time in policy reform, it's particularly at the national level where we do a lot of work, is can you have reform without funding? And it's kind of a chicken-egg question, right? I mean, do you need to have the funding in order to have the reform, or do you need to have the form in order to get the funding? And this issue came up when we released our transit report just a couple weeks ago, when the head of the MTA, who was there, said, well, don't bother with all this governance stuff, just give us the money. I mean, we need the money. That we can't reform ourselves because we don't have any money, and that's the problem, is money. Right. And the stakeholders are likely to say that. But on the other hand, you could argue that the fact that there's not enough money is one of the reasons that we've had trouble reforming our national transportation policy, because we don't have enough money, so we can't actually pass a national transportation policy, because money is what pays everyone off in order to actually get the bill passed in Congress. So I think it's an interesting question. Yeah. Which comes first, the reform or the funding?
That's a great question. I'll throw it out to the group. I've always kind of thought of it as one versus the other. I like you're reframing it as you need both, but which one triggers the other?
Can I just start with the Chicago example? Because I think that one's a good one. The one that Josh is talking about. Chicago's interesting because the transit institutions there have changed several times over several decades. And they were every time they were changed in order to solve the public transportation problem in metropolitan Chicago. So it's gone through, we decentralized and had PACE, the suburban operator, to spin off in order for the CTA to do better and all this stuff. In every case, as I said, it was a way to try to solve a problem. And the problem was actually financial. How do you pay all those subsidies? And given that Chicago is very dependent on its public transport system, it's not one where you could say, doesn't matter, only 2% of the people use it, so we don't care. This is not the case in Chicago. It's critical to the operation of the city. So that comes down to, unfortunately, fragmentation and spatial politics, right? So there's plenty of interest in the city of Chicago to pay for the transit system, to use the transit system, et cetera. There is no such buy-in from the suburban areas, much less the rural areas of the state. So in that case, the institutional change is almost a way of trying to get around the fundamental problem, which is the financial problem, which hasn't been solved. So in that case, you're getting the reform without the funding, but you're not getting the solution to the problem. So I think that's actually a good example.
It's an interesting.
I think in some cases, the problem is so severe that institutional change is faced, but that's usually because the institutions themselves are failing in some way.
Yeah, maybe you could also say there's a chicken and egg on the solution. There was also a chicken and egg on the problem.
Yeah, in China, actually, we so often talk about money. And we had a resource we called they called the official management. We have department working on that. It's like the human HR. That's what you can do. This problem is critical, and can you do it? If not, that I invite other people to do. So that's the Chinese way we do mostly. Mm-hmm. I know the problem there. Otherwise, I would not ask you to do. But you're here, you're the position to solve the problem. Of course, that's a capacity of the building, the capacity or capability of the people, they're different.
Sure.
But we do in another way, it's we sometimes invite let's say if we want the very strongly cooperation with the Department of Transportation and Department of the Policemen. So we sometimes invite the policeman to come to vice director of the Department of Transportation. That's many cities we do. And also we had we asking them to ask the commission. That is the panel discussion for the major decision making. So we do another way around it, not too much money, because currently the transit is not fully funded by the central government. We only give the subsidy to for the buses, for the fuel consumption. So almost no money.
Almost.
But the people, they move the people from one position to another position. That challenges the capability to solve the problem.
Harry?
I am on an optimistic tone, because I think it's time
Now?
I moved, yeah.
I should, 10 minutes left.
I should warn you, however, on the continued negative side, is that optimism bias in engineering mega infrastructure projects was part of the major problems. But let's not talk. But let me not go in that direction. Optimism. Let me try and. I'm actually extremely pleased that the topic of local participation is brought up, because our research has come to that same conclusion. And I'm also surprised and extremely pleased that the contagion idea of sustainability has taken. I mean, I was totally surprised. What's happening now is there's an operational, the global agenda in being operationalized is where the challenge is. And actually, I'll go on, which links to the local dimension, is part of the problem of the operationalization of the sustainability agenda, and especially in the transport field, is that it's been looked at from a global perspective, whereas the local perspective is now very, very important. And in fact, it's very important in London as it is in Brazil.
Sure.
And in that regard, I think we should be watching this space. What I'm worried about is that in certain cultural environments where there is an adversarial culture, this can create further delays. Where you have a more collaborative, and I worked in Indonesia, and there is a more collaborative attitude towards getting things done there, despite its history of autocracy. And indeed also in some parts of the continent, in France and Sweden, dare I say, where you actually go for a collaborative approach rather than an adversarial approach. That's not part of the British,
Sure.
I don't know if the Indians noticed, but that's not part of the British approach to doing things, right? So I think that there's huge opportunities to be had in participating, in having the local communities, in translating it. But all along, I think my biggest fear overriding that is that evolution of empowering the local capacity to respond going to take place at fast enough pace in light of the climate change challenges? Will we get it right after it's all too late? And I think that that's where, maybe to your surprise, I can understand the urgency element of, you know, we need to get things done now, because actually if you look at the climate change or if you look at the energy peaking issues, we don't have this time to work it out. But that can be agreed. If you put everything down on the table, that can be agreed by the local parties as well as the national parties.
Sure. Although the Trial Lawyers Association might have something to say about that. We have a kind of litigious approach to trying to do things. What do you think
to
to
get
this?
back to, I mean, Joshua's key question about which comes first, I think in most of these situations, it is actually the reform that takes place to unlock the financing, right? Because frankly, you know, the crisis that gets created is when people stop thinking that giving more money to fill in the blank entity is going to solve the problem, right? I think it's actually one of the things, you know, and Elliot, of course, has written the book on the topic, that I think people in the United States probably were far more naive about privatization 20 years ago. And now there's, I think, a great deal of skepticism because much of it didn't really work. And, you know, we've seen some of the great infrastructure privatizations of the last decade completely falling apart in this country because they were just, frankly, stupid financing mechanisms that ignored the fact that the public sector can almost always borrow money at a much lower cost. Right? So if all you're doing is financing, you don't want the private sector.
It's a dumb way to do it.
Right? But I think, you know, I mean, frankly, the MTA, if the MTA were a far more credible organization, I don't think it would have the problem getting the money. But when you look at every project has multiple delays, and delays measured in decades instead of years or months, you know, why would you believe that writing a $35 billion check to the MTA without changing it will get you what you want? And, you know, that lack of credibility, I think the, you know, the polling that we used to do with Building America's Future all demonstrated that one of the reasons that in the United States, most local referenda about raising taxes to fund transportation, they tend to pass because people believe that, oh, well, if you're going to raise my money here in my city or my area, and you're giving me a list of the projects you're going to spend it on, that's worth it. But raising the gas tax, sending it to Washington, putting it through the grist mill of Congress and US DOT, I don't believe I'll ever see any value from that. Right? And I think it's that lack of trust that makes people logically resistant to continue funding.
Yeah, I have to, one of the major proposals in the last couple of years in this region in New Jersey, there was a kind of asset monetization proposal for the Turnpike, and as part of the sales pitch for it, Governor Corzine would say, we have underfunded our pensions by $30 billion and are underfunding them by another $4 to $6 billion every year. And oh, would you give me $20 billion from selling the Turnpike? And the question came back, what are you going to do first? Is that just going to buy you a couple more years of the status quo, or are you going to do something first? And it was a fatal flaw to that. The other thing I have to say, of course, as Joshua pointed out, maybe we haven't hit like Chicago dirt bottom rock yet, and we have to do that to turn around.
The other possible answer is it depends.
Sure. John Orcutt, would you join us and give a few comments to this? And then I'd love to have, I don't know if we have time to go a little over since we started late to open it up to questions. But
well, I want to be very specific on this question about joining transportation and land use, because it really seems to me that in this century that we're calling, you know, the urban age, and that is really facing the primary challenge of climate change, what would help most of us around the world would be really to flip the current development template on its head, so that transit-oriented development or walkable urban development would be the default mode of development, and that if you wanted to build sprawl, you would have to go through all sorts of variances and reviews and extra layers of approval. And I think if you look at the markets that really held up in the United States through the Great Recession, the real estate markets, it was those transit-oriented, and it wasn't Dallas. It was those walkable places that people really valued and that could see surviving, kinds of real estate crashes. And it wasn't just center cities. It wasn't just Manhattan. It was edge cities that had developed that kind of mode, and it was towns, on the edges of metropolitan areas that also had walkable cores. So the question is, how do you accomplish something like that? And the answer is it depends, and context is huge. We talked a little bit yesterday here about how in New York, we have a tremendous assets in terms of transportation and density, but we still don't fully circuit the development picture together. We do a lot of one-off chasing of transportation capacity when we're talking about Hudson Yards or East Midtown development, but we don't have a system for thinking about value capture and getting real estate a little more in the game of transportation capacity. A smart, leadership and city government, I think, alone could do that here in New York City, and there is that real conversation to be had with the real estate industry, which is very sophisticated here and doesn't want to pay more, but I think could be seen to recognize its own interest in that. Other places is different. I think one of the real sort of innovative places in the United States to track now, and that's because of the climate legislation in California, which bizarrely is known as SB 375, has really put TOD on the map in a much bigger way in California than you ever saw before, and in a bigger way than it is on a widespread basis in most of the U.S. And you're seeing all kinds of ways to fast track and streamline TOD coming out of the urban regions and the metropolitan planning organizations and the real estate community itself in these areas. And so there's a lot of innovation happening at a granular level that could really feed a lot more best practices. But in New York State, for example, we do have smart growth legislation that is roundly ignored by everybody, including every unit of state government. But we don't have a state legislature, and that's the difference in context, that is really interested in public policy or follow through and it's seeing the results of the things that it enacts into law. So I don't know what the answer is in New York State. But it was a state government that coined the phrase smart growth. And what that has really run into, and we've seen that in a number of places since then, since the Glendening administration in Maryland, is the problem of institutionalizing change. And that's probably the question I want to throw out. I mean, I worked through the end of the McGreevey administration on some really interesting town planning and placemaking initiatives that were starting to come out of New Jersey DOT of all places, and that was really revolutionary. And those things didn't survive the administration, and that was true of the very similar initiatives coming out of the Rendell administration in Pennsylvania. Those policies are gone.
Sure.
On the other hand, I think some of the things we were able to accomplish in the Bloomberg administration, we were able to set in place. And so I think probably more important than consensus in enacting reform is leadership and early success.
Right.
One of the things that we got, we managed to do with street policies in New York was, as we implemented them, showed success, we transformed them into demand-driven policies. So now if you took away the Plaza program, there would be hell to pay politically if you did that. RIT was able to do a different thing with the Plan YC institution, which was simply enacted into law, so that Plan YC now has to be submitted to the city council every 4 years. Those are things some of these state institutions haven't done. There's a really good sort of transportation and land use reform going on now in Tennessee. It'll be interesting to see whether they are able to make it succeed the current administration and the personal leadership of the people leading that.
Sure. Well, that's let's put that to the team. What do you think about this relationship between leadership and institutional reform? And is it possible to create institutions that can survive a detrimental change in leadership?
Can I brag about California
Sure.
for a minute?
Yeah, he set you up for it.
Yeah, you really set that one up.
Yeah.
You really hit the nail on the head, and I'm really glad you brought up the whole issue of leadership. And this may come as a surprise to many people in the room, but it was Arnold Schwarzenegger who actually got that climate bill through the state legislature. And it really was because of his heavy-handed abilities to do that. I mean, truly his leadership got that done. And by having a piece of legislation on the books, of course, it's really hard to change legislation, right?
Right.
You can tweak at the margins, but to actually repeal something like AB 32 and so on is a big deal. So it was an early success, a leadership success that really set things on a path. There's still a lot of fighting. There's going to be backpedaling, et cetera, but that's a really good example, I think, of what leadership can do.
Yeah, I think there was a kind of interesting thing that the Romney administration in Massachusetts was also at a time talking and trying to do the same thing, but I remember they were quite upfront about it. It's executive order that they were doing it by, which was kind of a shortcut, and it didn't have many legs. Yeah, well.
But I think, to your example about California and AB 32, it actually did face a repeal. And what really got it solidified was the fact that on a 2-to-1 margin, the voters of California said, no, I don't want this to go away. I endorse it. And I think to your point, I mean, once you demonstrate well that something is good, and build a situation where, as you pointed out, it's not actually that the plazas were so good. It's that there would be political hell to pay, right, if you open more of Times Square back up to traffic today, right? And the fact is that at some point a couple of months ago, the de Blasio administration here in New York started getting attacked for not having talked about sustainability, right? So there had been enough of a consensus created. And I think, the sad fact is, and your point about the New York State legislature, when God knows, I think Thomas Jefferson is needed for solving that problem. Or maybe Robespierre, I'm not sure.
Andrew Cuomo. Cuomo.
Yeah. But the point there is that there was not the groundswell created where this is part of what state government does, or this is how New York State defines itself. And to a certain extent, the message, getting back to one of your earlier comments about democracy, is the ultimate thing about democracy is you get the government you deserve, right? And so if the people will hold the institutions accountable, ultimately they will change in a democratic institution to the extent that if your democracy works, the fact is the patience of the people to accept mediocre performance or failure is one of the key things that will delay reform.
Yeah, I have to respond to that. I mean, the idea that countries get the governments they deserve is, I think you like to reconsider that one. I mean, I think there are many, many countries that have governments that they certainly don't deserve. But let me move on to...
No, but Harry, hold on.
You mean in a dictatorship? Or?
In a democratic situation, to the extent that your democracy
That's not what
works,
you said. It's not what you said, but anyway.
No, it is actually what I said. In a democratic situation, you get the government you deserve. I mean, I actually think the people of New York... Hold on, wait a minute. Let me finish.
All right.
I think, the point is the people of New York State haven't actually paid attention to the underperformance of our state legislature, right? And the problem in the United States generally is, of course, the perennial problem that, oh yeah, I think Congress is doing a terrible job, but my congressperson, I'm going to reelect them, right? Or my state legislature, I allowed them to gerrymander the district so that there's no way to change that.
I'm trying to broaden the context here because I don't know what my arithmetic tells me, but I think the arithmetic is that there are less people living in democratic societies than there are. So if we're trying to broaden the lessons from this discussion, I think we can debate privately about the statement about whether people get the governments they deserve in democracy. But the fact of the matter is the vast majority of the population don't live in democracies. And this is another dimension. One has to deal with the realities of this. And the truth of the matter is, I mean, I lived and worked in the Suharto era in Indonesia. And the truth of the matter is a number of major projects which pushed forward a major development in the rural and urban area during that period took place. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, the autobahns were built during the Nazi period. And I mean, there is a correlation between infrastructure development and autocratic sort of governance. And if if that is the reality, not condoning it, there needs to be some realpolitik, and I'm probably the least person qualified to give lessons on realpolitik, but nonetheless, there needs to be, if we have these global sustainability challenges facing us, even the autocrats want to know about it, whether it's climate change, energy, or whatever, all these challenges. This is what's most compelling, and Heather's raised this, it's most compelling that these sustainable challenges hit the rich and the poor, hit the Democrats and the non-Democrats. And this is why I would argue resilience tests needs to be placed and needs to be presented. The realpolitik is that power is as it is, and for the moment, they are able to deliver and finance where they can the infrastructure. What I foresee, and I see this happening in Latin America in particular, but also possibly in India, perhaps even in China, I mean, Hong Kong's developments recently gave some other indications, is that I think that there is a feeling that the misspent funding on infrastructure is actually enough is enough. The losers are beginning to bite back. And it would be much better in a more constructive way, which is what I've been arguing, is that this energy be enhanced rather than actually have a project management delivery attitude towards let's change the organization in order to fit the infrastructure we want to deliver or the financial scheme we want. It needs, with all due respect, it needs on two counts, on a resilience test, because the problems are really huge and they affect both parties, and on a realpolitik sense, if you go to Latin America and if you go to some parts of Asia, I think that the appetite for local participation and that presentation about bikes actually was significant, because with information technology, you're now going to empower more and more, and people are going to learn more and more. And I'd like to know how that's going to pan out. And that's quite exciting. And if I'll conclude there, if the sustainability agenda truly has taken roots, I think this is a new exciting future for the public sector, the private sector. And I tell you what, I'd put my investments in companies that are retrofitting infrastructure projects for the new climate change agendas. I'm going to make more money as a non-capitalist out of putting money in that kind of business rather than the businesses which are business as usual, which actually have a very limited lifespan.
Okay. I'll give you one last comment, sure.
Yeah.
I'm getting the signal.
Actually, in 2000, our former Premier Zhu Rongji, who had the last meeting office, and he said the car is not the transportation solution for future in China, and public transportation should be there. But actually the policy guideline just come out for the promoting public transportation just 2012. That's the 1 year before. So the 10 years have been missed. So that is the testing I think the challenges and the fast saying for the leadership, top leadership, I think. That's the first one. And secondly, talking about you're talking about the infrastructure, because there are not money flowing. And I also we say in China, basically you say which institute in charge? No, because used to be the 1/3 of the fortune for China. That's it, before the 1970s. But afterwards, it's easier to buy. So low, only transportation responsible for the backing. And the working, we talk about the design, but which institution looking for that? You will find some bracket. So again, once the institution changing, we are looking for backwards. We have the 5,000 years history, and in the past, we still have the many good things. So I think we probably come to say in the past what we should learn, and also how can we accommodation with the car culture we have. That is from outside. And take Beijing and Shanghai as example. They take the car management. They 12 years ago current Beijing. So you will say the CO2 emission from per capita, they have the 50% less than Beijing. So that challenges again to the leader for the city and the leader for the nation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we can continue this over coffee in the hallway. We've talked about sustainability, resilience, leadership, participation, reform, and revenues. Just join me in thanking this wonderful panel and the 3 terrific respondents. And thanks. Now we have a break, and then we'll come back.
And then we're going to talk about leadership.
And then we're going to talk about leadership. There's the segue. Thank you.